I want to continue discussing the concept of defining a term or a state of being or thing. And I want to broaden it a bit because the goal behind creating a definition is essentially to provide clarification, either for a specific idiosyncratic way you are going to use a word or a concept, or the limited way in which you're going to use a word or a concept because you don't have full knowledge of it. And we often call those working definitions. And the idea behind a working definition is, well, to the best of my ability, until I get more information, until we see more penetratingly into the matter, we're going to have to assume it's just this, X, Y, Z, or whatever. But, you're trying to give clarity. Okay, so there's some other ways you can do it besides. Again, if you do online research on this, if you look in a logic book and you try to find the different types of definitions, you're going to get the clear and cut categories that are out there that are really formed in the classroom, and they're formed that way because they're easy to teach. It's very easy to teach terms, a term, just a basic category. But does that really capture the different ways you can do this? All right. So I want to suggest some other ways. Okay, and I don't think this ever really gives a technical definition of something, but it goes a long way, okay, to accomplishing the essential goal of creating definition, and that's clarification. And that's the goal. What you would do here, consider the technique of analogy, all right? An analogy is when you take two things, X and not X. Well, no, not Y, X and Y, okay? You take two things. And you get a sense that your audience know what Y is, but you get a sense they don't know what X is. And you say, well, look, I'm going to illuminate you about X, as far as I understand it. By showing you Y, now we all know what Y is. There are some elements in Y that are very similar to some elements in X. So, think of elements 1, 2, 3 in Y. Do you understand those things? Do you see how that works? Well, they're in X. They're in X. So, in fact, Y resembles X in many ways. Maybe there are some other elements or activity in Y that carry over to X. So if you understand Y, you really go a lot farther to understand X. So that might be a way to do it. Now you have to think of a good analogy. Okay. And you can develop the analogy doesn't have to come from the natural world or from a thing that already exists. You can say, imagine this, okay? What is it like to live in a world that has different sovereign states in it, and whose rules are formed by these sovereign states, and depending on where you are in this world, you are going to be under different rules. Well, consider a mansion with 20 rooms in it, and each room has its own master of the room, and as soon as you walk into that room, you are going to be under some written laws that pertain and obtain only in that room, for people in that room. That's the legal system of that room. As soon as you walk out of that room, you go down to another room, and automatically you're inside this other room. You are now under a different set of laws. How would you feel living in a house like that, when you knew you had to occupy these different rooms? You might use this to discuss how it is, what it means to live in a globe of different nations. Something like that. That would be an analogy, and it would serve to clarify the term you're trying to define. Now, another way you can do this is cause and effect. Is if you really try to clarify some elements about this thing you're trying to define by saying, look, this thing causes this, and it causes that, and so you position it in a chain of events that people are going to be familiar with, okay? But they may not be familiar with the X you're trying to define, with its place in the chain. And if you start defining it as an effect or a cause of something, they are better able perhaps to grasp its overall position or influence or essence. All right. So when one thing that seems to be part of a tornado is that it's always uncontrolled. I've never seen a tornado that has been controlled. So it causes chaos. It causes random chaos. Now, I'm not saying housing destruction, because it might happen in the desert, but it rips apart the desert. Whatever it touches, it doesn't produce design. It produces entropy. So, and it's just uncontrollable. So you might say, a tornado is essentially something that causes this, causes that. Now, it also seems that tornadoes always involve wind, but see, that would be, at that point, you would be more focusing on the elements of the thing, because a nice spring day is going to involve wind too. Well, that's not a tornado. But a tornado does seem to always need wind. So, but the wind has to be such that it's causing chaos. And now, how do you distinguish that from a hurricane? Well, now you got to talk about the tunnel form and what causes a tornado, the type of clouds. So then you would approach tornado in terms of it's an effect of something, of another cause, a prior cause, and you can go on that way. But that's an effective way. Now, what about context? Okay, so you might be able to, especially when you're describing an activity or a state of being, but especially an activity. If you can describe the context that happens around this activity, it might help a person understand that thing. So, if you want to describe, if you want to have a person get a notion of what it means to be a driver, you might say you're sitting around, you have a chair, you have a steering wheel in front of you, you have windows on the side of you, a driver of a vehicle. You're low to the ground, relatively low. Almost always you're going to have wheels underneath you. You feel the vibration of the motor, and as you usually have some sort of steering apparatus in front of you. So you're describing the context around. Okay, so think of this. How do you define parent? Wouldn't it be by definition, part of it might be involved with the context? You have children around. Now, we can get a little technical here, an active parent, a passive parent, because what do you call a parent whose children are grown up and gone away? I mean, biologically, they're still a parent, but are they parenting at that point? So to be a parent, you might say it has something to do with parenting, and parenting has something to do with the context that it's done in. It's done in a house with children around you. I might be stretching it there, but that's how you would approach it with context. Now, another something you could pull in is what I call the spectrum definition, okay? And I would encourage you to think about this, because this is probably, well, I think that it does a decent job. The spectrum definition. Now, the closest thing I've seen to this sort of idea is the philosophical notion of the qualia. Okay, now a qualia definition. The qualia is this. Now, it came from a professor who wrote a famous article. Actually, you should read this. Find it. It's out there. It's not that long. But I think the title of the article was, "What does it feel like to be a bat?" And that was his question. If you're a bat, how would it feel like to be a bat? What would it feel like to be upside down? And, it's a little bit of humor there, because who knows how it feels like to be a bat, but the bat. And that was his point, okay? Sometimes the thing is so hard to define that you have to include the whole spectrum. The whole, as much of it as you can. You have to involve cause and effect. You have to involve context. You have to involve emotional. What does it? What are you? What sort of activity are you involved in? What sort of general sine qua nons do you have? But more so, it has to do with the psychology of something. I mean, what and the activity, what are you doing here? So what I'm trying to say is that the spectrum definition is like bringing out all the guns, okay, and saying, look, I've got a term to define. We can define it in terms of a subject, or a noun, if you want to use that terminology. A noun, a thing. We can define it in terms of an activity. If it's an activity, someone does it, we can talk about the context this is done in. We can talk about the cause and effect it has. We can talk about what it would feel like to be doing this. What is the psychological especially when this thing you're trying to define involves people. What's the psychological commitment or state that people get invested in here? Um, what are the habits that develop when someone is this, like a doctor or a teacher? How does one begin to view a goal in life? So you then approach it in terms of major goals, and you know what it really is? It's really item analysis. But you start off with trying to give a definition, but then you just expand it in as many ways as you can. Bring in an analogy. Do whatever you can to end up with a nice description uh, of the activity and also of the elements that go into making this thing what it is. And I call that the spectrum definition approach, because you're trying to do the full spectrum. I mean, it's you're not just focusing on one technique, you're bringing them all in. So, this is maybe as a fancy way of just saying, engage as many of these techniques that you can to eventually make it work for your audience. Get them to the point where you feel they are where you want them to be concerning this term that you are trying to define.